The winter resort, Northern Wind, was known for its secluded atmosphere, sought after by many travelers wishing to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. The small wooden cottages, located on the slopes of the mountains, created the perfect place for those looking to enjoy solitude and fresh mountain air. However, behind the cozy exterior, there was a darkness that could catch those who dared to stay too long. Mark and Natalia, a couple who decided to spend their vacation in this remote corner, had no idea that beyond their cheerful expectations, something terrifying lurked. When they arrived at the resort, they were greeted by a gloom that hung over the area. The fog, which thickened in the evening hours, obscured the mountain peaks, and even during the day, it did little to alleviate the sense of isolation. The cottage they had booked was at the farthest corner, where no other houses were nearby. Surrounding them was only forest and deep snow-covered slopes. The first night passed quietly, but by morning, Mark noticed something strange. As he walked around the area, taking a few photos for memories, his gaze was drawn to an old sign at the base of the nearest hill. It had something scratched into it: "Do not stay here." He showed it to Natalia, but she just laughed, thinking it was a relic from the past. After all, the resort had been built many years ago, and maybe it was just a forgotten warning. The next day, they went skiing, enjoying the silence and seclusion. But the further they ventured into the forest, the more they felt an eerie unease. It was as if something or someone was watching them. When they stopped to rest, they suddenly heard a strange sound from behind the trees. It was like someone was walking behind them, but when they turned around, no one was there. Natalia suggested they head back, but Mark insisted they continue. By evening, when they returned to the cottage, they discovered that the door was slightly ajar. This was odd, as they clearly remembered locking it before leaving. At first, they thought it might just be the wind. In bed, expecting nothing unusual, a faint noise broke the stillness. It was barely audible, like a scraping sound, as though something heavy was being dragged across the floor. Mark got up to check, but as he approached the door, everything went still. He stood there, at the threshold, straining to listen, but there was nothing. Suddenly, Natalia, almost whispering, said, "Do you hear that? Someone's out there." Mark gripped the door handle tightly, but just as he was about to open it, the door suddenly swung open with a loud creak, revealing a figure in a dark coat. His heart leapt in his chest. It was a woman, or what had once been a woman. Her face was pale and distorted, as if the skin had dried and stretched unnaturally tight over the bones. Her eyes were hollow, dark sockets, empty of all life. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. Mark and Natalia backed away into the corner, the door slamming shut behind them. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed through the house, soft but persistent, as though someone was walking through the corridor, moving through the shadows. Mark's body froze with a chill, while Natalia clutched him, trying not to let her fear show. They didn't know what to do. Suddenly, outside the window, they heard the howl of the wind, and in the darkness, a shadow passed swiftly, resembling the silhouette of a person running through the snow. But when they stepped outside the next morning, the snow was untouched, not a single footprint to be seen. Quietly, almost like a whisper, something deep within the forest seemed to call to them, and with every passing hour, the dread grew heavier. The next day, Mark and Natalia decided to leave. But when they went to the lodge's front desk to check out, the manager was nowhere to be found. The receptionist, an older woman with a cold stare, greeted them without a word, barely looking up from her work. When they asked her about the strange occurrences, she said nothing but gestured toward the door with an expression that seemed almost knowing. As they left the building, a soft voice, barely a murmur, echoed in the still air, "It's already too late." At that moment, the fog thickened, creeping around them like a living thing, and the path back to the town seemed longer than it had when they first arrived. The trees, their branches heavy with snow, loomed over them like silent sentinels, their twisted shapes stretching toward the sky. As they made their way down the narrow road, the wind picked up, and Mark thought he heard faint whispers carried by the breeze. "Don't look back," Natalia whispered, her eyes wide with fear, her voice trembling. But Mark couldn't help it. As they walked, he glanced over his shoulder, his breath catching in his throat. Standing just outside the edge of the resort, in the shadow of the trees, was the woman. Her face still contorted in that unsettling, unnatural grimace, watching them with empty eyes. They ran. They didn't stop until they reached the nearest town, their hearts pounding, but the unsettling feeling didn't leave them. The whispers, the footsteps, and the figure in the fog had followed them in their minds. They knew they hadn't escaped. They'd only delayed the inevitable. Years later, when the resort was abandoned, no one dared to visit. The fog still lingered over the mountains, and those who had been brave enough to venture into the area spoke of strange lights in the distance, figures watching from the trees, and a curse that would never let go. But the most chilling thing of all was the sign that had once been so casually dismissed: "Do not stay here." Now, no one could say whether it had been a warning, or a prophecy. Years passed, and the memory of Mark and Natalia's encounter at the resort faded into the realm of local legends. The once popular Northern Wind resort was abandoned, left to the elements. Nature slowly began reclaiming the area, wrapping the cottages in thick vines and snow. The fog, however, never left. It lingered, like an uninvited guest, settling in for the long winters. Local villagers, who lived in a small town at the base of the mountain, warned travelers to stay away from the cursed resort. Despite their warnings, there were always those who were curious or fearless enough to venture into the misty woods. It was on one of those mist-covered days that a group of college students, seeking thrills and adventure, decided to explore the old resort. They'd heard rumors of its haunted past but brushed it off as superstition. Armed with nothing but their smartphones and a sense of invincibility, they packed into an old van and drove up the winding road that led to the resort. They had no idea what awaited them. The air grew colder as they neared the abandoned cottages. The fog seemed denser here, almost suffocating, and the trees loomed like twisted shadows, their bare branches creaking in the wind. The students joked nervously, taking pictures and daring each other to walk into the resort's dilapidated buildings. The first signs of something wrong appeared when they entered the main lodge. The door creaked open with a force that seemed unnatural. Inside, the temperature dropped dramatically, and the smell of mold and decay hit them all at once. The once grand interior was now a ruin, with broken furniture and shattered windows. Despite the obvious signs of neglect, the students felt a strange sense of unease. "I don't like this," one of the girls, Rachel, muttered. She had a bad feeling from the moment they stepped inside. "Let's just leave." But the others laughed it off. They were determined to make their visit memorable, to prove that they were brave enough to face the unknown. They explored room after room, each one more unsettling than the last. The walls were covered in dark stains, as though the building itself had been slowly bleeding for years. Strange markings were carved into the floors and walls, symbols that none of them could decipher. Then they found the basement. The door to the cellar was hidden behind a broken wardrobe in the far corner of the lodge. It was old, covered in layers of dust, but it opened with an eerie squeal. A cold gust of air rushed up from the darkness below. Without a second thought, they descended the creaky steps, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The basement was smaller than they expected, filled with old boxes and rusted metal equipment. But in the far corner, there was something that made their blood run cold, a small, wooden altar, covered in dust and cobwebs. Surrounding it were objects they couldn't quite make out in the dim light, but there was something deeply unsettling about the arrangement. A thick, foul stench hung in the air, and the temperature dropped even further, as if the very atmosphere was choking on something ancient and foul. Suddenly, one of the students, Ben, noticed something written on the wall. The letters were faded but still legible: "The forest will claim you, one by one." Before anyone could react, there was a soft rustling sound from the corner of the basement. At first, they thought it was just a rat or some other creature, but then they heard it more clearly: whispers. Low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from all directions, from the very walls themselves. Rachel froze. Her eyes widened in terror as she whispered, "We need to get out. Now." The others hesitated, unsure whether to believe her. But just as they started to move, a sudden crashing sound came from above. The ceiling groaned as if something heavy was shifting. The temperature dropped so abruptly that they could see their breath in the air, and the sound of footsteps echoed from above, moving quickly, backslash. Then came the voice. It wasn't human. It was a low, gurgling rasp, a sound that felt like it was clawing its way up from the depths of the earth itself. "Leave, while you can," it whispered, the voice thick with malice. The students bolted toward the stairs, panic overtaking their senses. But when they reached the top of the stairs, the door to the basement slammed shut with a deafening crash. They tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The whispering grew louder, now accompanied by scratching, as if something was trying to get to them from the other side. Ben, panicked, turned to the others. "We need to break the door down." But as they pounded on the door, something dark moved behind them. One of the students, Matt, screamed as something cold and damp brushed against his neck. They turned, and standing at the end of the corridor was the same figure that had haunted Mark and Natalia's last night at the resort, the woman, her skin stretched tight over her skull, her hollow eyes locked onto them. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. The students stumbled back, fear rooting them to the spot. They tried to scream, but their voices were choked off by the cold, suffocating air that rushed in around them. The last thing they saw before everything went dark was the woman's face, grinning with a grotesque satisfaction. The next morning, the van was found abandoned at the foot of the mountain, its windows rolled down and doors wide open. Inside, there were no signs of the students. The police scoured the area, but they found no trace of them, no footprints in the snow, no signs of a struggle. The only thing that remained was the faint, distant sound of whispers on the wind, drifting out of the fog. The Northern Wind Resort was eventually forgotten once again. The townspeople spoke of it in hushed tones, warning anyone who would listen to stay far, far away. The fog still lingered, never truly fading. And deep in the heart of the mountain, something still waited, hungry for those foolish enough to challenge the curse. It had been years since the disappearance of the college students, and the locals had long stopped speaking of the resort. The mountain, once a source of fascination and dread, had slowly faded into the background of everyday life. The townspeople lived their lives, wary but unwilling to look back at the darkness that lurked in the forgotten corners of the world. But rumors still floated in the air like the ever-present fog that clung to the mountain. Strange occurrences continued to surface, the occasional car that would mysteriously break down on the road leading to the resort, the unexplained sounds heard by hikers in the woods, and the sightings of a shadowy figure moving between the trees when the fog rolled in. Despite the warnings, there were always those who dared to venture up to the resort, drawn by curiosity or the thrill of the unknown. One of those was a young man named David, an aspiring photographer who had recently arrived in the town. He had heard the faint whispers of the resort's haunting, and to him, it seemed like the perfect subject for his portfolio. He was skeptical of the local superstitions, convinced that the stories were exaggerated. To him, it was just an abandoned place, perhaps with a history, but certainly not the dark, cursed entity the townspeople made it out to be. One autumn evening, when the fog was particularly thick, David decided to take his camera and explore the old resort. He wanted to capture the eerie atmosphere of the place, its decay, its isolation. He wasn't prepared for what he would find. Driving up the winding road, he felt a strange sensation, as if the air itself was growing heavier, thicker with each passing mile. The headlights of his car cut through the fog, illuminating the ghostly outlines of trees and snow-covered ground. When he reached the entrance to the resort, he parked his car and stepped out. The silence was overwhelming. Not a sound could be heard except for the soft rustle of the wind, but even that felt distant and muffled. David approached the lodge cautiously, his camera in hand. The building loomed in front of him, its windows dark and lifeless, the roof sagging from years of neglect. The door creaked as he pushed it open, a low, groaning sound that seemed to echo through the vast emptiness inside. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for the season, and it smelled of rot and mildew. David flicked on his flashlight, casting a beam of light across the room. Broken furniture was scattered around, and the remnants of old decorations hung limply on the walls, like forgotten memories. He stepped further inside, his boots crunching on the dirt floor, and began to take photos of the decay. Then, he heard it. A soft scraping sound, coming from below. At first, he dismissed it, thinking it was just the building settling, but the noise persisted. It was rhythmic, deliberate, as if something, or someone, was moving in the dark beneath him. David's heart began to race. He turned toward the staircase leading to the basement, where the sound seemed to be coming from. He hesitated. Part of him wanted to leave. But another part, the photographer's curiosity, urged him to explore. He knew he had to go down there, his instincts told him that it would be the shot of a lifetime. With his flashlight shaking slightly in his hand, David descended into the basement. The temperature dropped even further as he reached the bottom of the stairs. The air was thick, heavy with something foul, and the light from his flashlight seemed to barely penetrate the suffocating darkness. The source of the scraping noise became clearer. It was coming from the far corner of the basement, where an old wooden door stood ajar. The door was covered in strange marks, symbols carved into the wood, their meaning lost to time. David's heart thudded in his chest as he approached the door, each step feeling like a century. As he pushed the door open, a gust of freezing air rushed out, making him stumble back. The room beyond was small, cluttered with old, forgotten objects. But there, in the center of the room, was an altar, just like the one the college students had found. It was covered in dust, and strange objects surrounded it, candles, animal bones, and other ritualistic items that sent a chill down his spine. But it wasn't the altar that made David's blood run cold. It was the shape in the corner, a hunched figure, its back turned to him. The scraping noise had stopped. "Hello?" David called out, his voice sounding impossibly small in the vast silence. There was no answer, just the oppressive, suffocating air that made him feel as though he were suffocating. The figure turned slowly, its face hidden in shadow. As it came into the light, David saw what it was, a woman. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were deep, hollow pits. Her face, just like the stories described, was stretched tight over her skull, as if the skin was too thin for the bones beneath. Her mouth opened, revealing a smile too wide, too unnatural. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice a guttural rasp that seemed to vibrate through David's chest. Before he could react, the room seemed to tilt. The air turned icy cold, and his breath turned to mist. He reached for his camera, desperate to capture the moment, but the woman's eyes locked onto his, and everything went black. The next morning, the fog had thickened even more, and the town was on edge. A search party had been formed for David, who had gone missing the previous night. His car was found abandoned by the resort, the door ajar. But there was no sign of him. Not even footprints in the snow. The townspeople knew what had happened. A few weeks later, the local newspaper ran a story about the missing photographer, but the headline seemed almost too familiar. Another lost to the fog. The article mentioned how the search had been unsuccessful and how, despite the efforts of the authorities, there was no trace of David. The last person to see him was a hiker, who had reported seeing him near the old resort the day before he disappeared. The hiker claimed that David had been acting strangely, almost as if he was being pulled toward the building. As the days passed, the fog didn't lift. It remained, suffocating the mountain in a thick, damp shroud. The townspeople, though nervous, went about their business. They had learned long ago that there was no escaping the curse of the resort, no matter how much they tried to ignore it. And so, they continued to live, always looking over their shoulder, always wondering who would be the next to vanish into the darkness of the mountain. The fog, it seemed, was never going to leave. The months passed, and David's disappearance became yet another whispered legend among the townspeople. The locals, who had long since learned to keep their distance from the mountain, now lived in a quiet, anxious tension. The fog, which never seemed to dissipate, continued to hang over the town and the forgotten resort, an oppressive presence that cast its shadow over everything. But something changed after David's disappearance. There were reports, half-formed, of more sightings, figures in the fog, shapes that moved just at the edge of vision, fleeting shadows darting through the trees. And in the dead of night, some claimed to hear distant voices, faint and pleading, carried on the wind. One night, as winter descended once more, an unexpected visitor arrived in town. A man in his late 30s, disheveled but determined, stepped off the bus and into the sleepy village. His name was Samuel, and he was a historian from the city, sent to investigate the mysterious history of the mountain resort. The townspeople eyed him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, but Samuel was undeterred. He had heard of the resort's haunting reputation and, against all warnings, had decided to uncover the truth behind the place. He went straight to the local inn, where he rented a room for the night. The innkeeper, an older woman with a face carved from years of worry, seemed reluctant to speak of the resort. But after some gentle persuasion, she shared the barest fragments of its history. The resort was once a place of luxury, she began, her voice low, as if she feared someone might overhear. But something changed. People started disappearing. People who stayed too long, people who got curious about the old stories. They didn't come back. And eventually, it was abandoned, but not by everyone. She paused, glancing nervously over her shoulder, and then continued in a whisper. The fog, it keeps them there. Keeps them all there. Samuel pressed her for more information, but the innkeeper fell silent, shaking her head, as if afraid to speak any further. She said only one thing more before retreating into the back room: if you're going up there, you'll be like the others. You won't leave. Nobody does. Samuel, however, was resolute. His thirst for answers drove him to the mountain resort that very night. Armed with his research and a stubborn sense of purpose, he made his way up the fog-covered road, the cold air biting into his skin. The dense fog wrapped around him, obscuring the path ahead, making it feel like he was walking through an endless tunnel. He reached the resort just after midnight. The once beautiful lodge, now a rotting carcass of its former self, loomed in the distance, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the void. The air seemed still, but Samuel felt an unease, an oppressive weight that hung in the air. For a moment, he stood at the threshold of the lodge, staring at the door that had been left ajar, just as it had been in the stories. Despite the overwhelming sense of dread, he pushed forward, entering the building. The air was frigid, like stepping into a tomb. It smelled of decay, and the creaking of old wood echoed through the empty hallways. Samuel took out his flashlight and shone it around, illuminating the remnants of the resort's former life: tattered curtains, broken chairs, and shattered windows. His heart pounded in his chest, but he pressed on, convinced that this was the moment when he would finally uncover the truth. He ventured deeper into the lodge, toward the basement, the place where the legends always seemed to converge. As he descended the narrow staircase, a sense of cold dread washed over him. The further he went, the darker and colder it became, until he felt as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. And then he saw it, the altar. It was exactly as the rumors had described, old, covered in dust, with strange symbols carved into the stone. But this time, there was something more. A figure stood before it, its back to Samuel. It was a woman, just like the one in the stories, her skin tight against her bones, her eyes blackened pits of emptiness. Samuel froze, his breath catching in his throat. The woman turned slowly, and her face twisted into that grotesque smile that had haunted every tale. "You should have stayed away," she whispered, her voice rasping like dry leaves in the wind. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, and the shadows in the room seemed to grow, stretching and warping into strange, twisted shapes. The woman's smile widened, revealing jagged, unnatural teeth. Samuel tried to move, but his feet felt as though they were glued to the floor. His chest tightened, the air pressing against him like a physical weight. The whispers began, low and insistent, coming from all directions, overlapping, filling the room with a maddening cacophony. He managed to break free from the paralysis, stumbling backward toward the staircase, his heart racing. But as he turned to flee, the door to the basement slammed shut with a deafening crash. Trapped. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls bending, the shadows thickening. The woman stepped toward him, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by unseen strings. With every step she took, the whispers grew louder, becoming a chorus of voices, calling out in agony, in pain, in warning. "Join us," she rasped, her voice echoing through the basement, "join the ones who cannot leave." Samuel backed into the corner, his mind racing for an escape. But there was no way out. Not now. Not here. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the room fell silent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and Samuel's heart began to slow. But something was wrong. The shadows weren't gone, they were watching him now, gathering at the edges of the room. The woman was gone, but the cold lingered, and the whispers had not ceased. His flashlight flickered and died. And in the pitch-black darkness of the basement, the whispers began again, more insistent, more frantic. "You're not alone. You'll never leave." The next morning, the town awoke to find that Samuel, too, had vanished without a trace. His car remained parked by the road, the door ajar, the engine still warm. The authorities combed the area, but once again, there were no footprints in the snow, no evidence of a struggle. The fog had rolled in thicker than ever. No one dared to speak of Samuel's disappearance aloud. The townspeople knew better. They knew that some things were best left undisturbed. And up on the mountain, the resort waited, its fog never lifting, its whispers calling for the next curious soul to wander too close. The months after Samuel's disappearance blurred together in the town. The fog remained ever-present, like an oppressive blanket that smothered the land. People went about their daily routines, though with a heightened awareness of the strange, unexplainable events that seemed to be growing more frequent. Whispers of Samuel's fate lingered in hushed conversations, but no one dared speak of the resort directly. To mention it aloud, in front of others, was considered a taboo. It was as if the mere act of acknowledging the resort could summon whatever dark presence resided there. Then, one cold winter's evening, a letter arrived at the town's post office, its address written in a familiar, shaky handwriting. The letter was addressed to Emily, the innkeeper who had warned Samuel about the dangers of the resort. She was the one who had seen the most, who knew more about the place than anyone else in the town, yet she had always been reluctant to speak. The letter was short, its words haunting and cryptic, the ink smudged in places, as though the writer had been in a rush. The fog is not just weather. It's a door. The ones who stayed, they are still here. Do not forget us. The resort will claim more. It wants us all. D. Emily sat at her desk, the letter trembling in her hands. She recognized the handwriting instantly, David's. It had to be. But how? He was gone. Vanished into the same mist that had claimed so many before him. The letter was impossible. Yet there it was, right in front of her. She locked the letter away in the drawer of her desk, but it haunted her. Every night, the whispers grew louder. The fog outside seemed to swirl in unnatural patterns. The wind carried voices, low and indistinct, like murmurs just on the edge of hearing. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't ignore it anymore. The past was clawing its way back. It wasn't long before Emily decided she would go up the mountain. She knew it was a risk, a terrible one, but the message, the presence of the letter, had driven her to the brink of madness. She needed to understand. She needed to know why the resort was never truly abandoned, why the fog never lifted. And so, one bitter night, Emily packed a small bag and left her inn. Her heart was heavy with dread as she made her way up the mountain road. The air grew colder as she climbed, and the fog became denser, curling around her like tendrils, guiding her toward the place she had spent years avoiding. When she reached the gates of the resort, she paused. The lodge stood in front of her, its decaying walls now more ominous than ever. The windows were dark, like vacant eyes, and the wind howled through the broken timbers. Emily felt as though she had crossed some invisible line. She was no longer on solid ground but on the edge of something far darker than she could comprehend. She entered the lodge. Inside, the air was stale and damp, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Emily's footsteps echoed in the silence as she moved through the empty hallways, the darkness seeming to press in on her from all sides. She made her way down the familiar corridor, toward the basement, the place she had feared for so long. As she descended the stairs, the temperature dropped, and she felt the oppressive weight of something unseen. The whispers began again, this time louder, more distinct. They were not coming from one place but from everywhere. The very walls seemed to hum with an energy that felt alive, pulsing like a heartbeat. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement door creaked open by itself. Emily's breath caught in her throat, but she stepped forward, compelled by a force she couldn't explain. The air inside the basement was thick with decay, and the scent of something ancient and foul clung to her like a shadow. The altar was still there. But now, something else was different. The space around the altar was cluttered with objects, old books, broken mirrors, twisted metal pieces, all arranged in a pattern that resembled some sort of ritual. And there, standing at the altar, was a figure. It was not the woman Emily had seen in the stories. This figure was different. It was tall, its form distorted, elongated. The face was a blank void, as if the features had been erased, and only the darkness remained. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly approached. The figure did not move, but she could feel its presence, its weight. It was as if the room itself had taken on a life of its own, the shadows seeming to twist and writhe, beckoning her closer. The whispers grew louder. "Welcome, Emily," the voice rasped, but it was not the woman's voice. It was many voices, layered on top of one another, distorted and garbled. "You've come to join us." Emily's legs trembled, and she tried to take a step back, but she was frozen in place. Her mind screamed at her to run, to escape, but her body would not obey. The figure's presence pressed in on her, filling her vision with darkness. "The ones who never leave," the voice continued. "The ones who never escape." And then, she saw them, shadows, figures rising from the floor, the walls, the very air around her. Faces, pale and twisted, their eyes hollow. They were the lost, the ones who had come before her, all trapped in the same eternal prison, bound to the fog, to the resort. In the chaos of it all, Emily realized the truth. The fog was not just a storm. It was a gateway, a boundary between the world of the living and the cursed souls that lingered here, trapped in an endless cycle, doomed to repeat the same fate over and over again. The resort was not just a place, it was a prison, a place designed to claim the curious, the brave, and the foolish, and never let them leave. The last thing Emily saw before the darkness swallowed her was the figure stepping forward, its void-like face drawing closer, its whisper now in her ears, cold as death. "Join us, Emily. You'll never leave." Days later, the villagers noticed that Emily's inn had remained empty. No one had seen her since she left for the mountain, and there was no sign of her return. The fog, if anything, had grown denser. And deep in the heart of the mountain, the resort stood, as it always had, waiting for the next soul to cross its threshold. Days turned into weeks, and the town began to change. The inn, once a bustling gathering place, stood silent and empty. The fog, as thick as ever, clung to the streets and rolled across the hills like a living thing. The villagers had grown accustomed to it, though the unease never fully left their hearts. It was as if the fog was a reminder of the resort, of the darkness that still lingered, waiting. No one dared speak of Emily's disappearance. The town seemed to hold its breath, as though afraid that mentioning her name would draw her back, or worse, pull them all into the same curse. But there was one person who refused to ignore what was happening. A young man named Thomas, the son of the town's blacksmith, had always been fascinated by the stories surrounding the resort. He had grown up hearing the older villagers whisper of the resort's haunted past and the strange occurrences that seemed to follow it, but it was Emily's disappearance that pushed him past curiosity and into determination. Thomas had always been an adventurous soul. Where others saw danger, he saw an opportunity for truth, and he couldn't sit idly by while his friends and family fell into fear. After weeks of restless nights, he finally decided that he would venture up to the resort, despite the risks. He had heard the whispers of the cursed place since he was a child, but now, the disappearance of Emily felt like a call he couldn't ignore. One evening, when the fog was particularly thick, Thomas packed a small satchel with supplies, took a lantern, and set out. The streets were eerily empty, the houses dark, and even the usual sounds of night, dogs barking, the wind rustling through trees, seemed absent. The entire town was holding its breath, and it felt like Thomas was the only one still moving. As he made his way up the mountain road, his mind raced. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but deep down, he knew that something was waiting for him, something that had claimed the others, and something that might try to claim him too. The fog was unnaturally dense, thick as soup, and his lantern's light barely cut through it. The road was winding, narrowing as he ascended higher and higher, until he reached the base of the lodge. The sight of it made his blood run cold. The resort loomed before him, silhouetted against the mist, its crumbling walls shrouded in the ever-present fog. The windows were dark, hollow. The air was oppressively still. He stood at the threshold for a long moment, his breath shallow, before stepping inside. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, and the cold air inside hit him like a wall. The faint smell of decay filled his nostrils, like something old, forgotten, and deeply wrong. He stepped into the darkened hallway, the wooden floor creaking beneath his boots. His heart was pounding, but he pressed on, his lantern casting eerie, flickering shadows across the walls. The silence was suffocating. He could feel it, that strange weight pressing down on him, as if the house itself was watching him. He moved deeper into the building, his footsteps slow and deliberate. The furniture was rotting, broken, and the walls were covered in thick layers of dust and mold. But it was the basement that called to him, the place where so many had vanished, the place where the darkness seemed to thrive. Without hesitation, he descended the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the flickering light of his lantern cast long, trembling shadows down the stone steps. His skin prickled with the feeling that he was being watched, and every instinct screamed at him to turn back. But he couldn't. He had to know. When he reached the bottom, the door to the basement opened on its own, groaning as if protesting his intrusion. He stepped inside, and the darkness enveloped him like a thick, suffocating blanket. He could hear his own breath, shallow and rapid, but there was something else, a low, persistent hum, like a distant chant. The altar was still there, but now, it was surrounded by more symbols, more signs that spoke of rituals, of something much darker than the town had ever known. The stone altar was stained, as if it had been used more recently than anyone cared to admit. Broken mirrors, twisted iron objects, and old, burnt-out candles were scattered around it, forming a ritualistic pattern. The cold in the room was unbearable, and the whispers returned. They were coming from everywhere. They were faint, distorted, yet unmistakable. A chorus of voices, overlapping, all speaking at once. Join us, become one with the fog, never leave. Thomas's hand tightened around the lantern. His throat tightened, too, and he felt a wave of nausea. He turned slowly, and there, standing at the far end of the room, was the figure. At first, he thought it was a shadow, just another part of the darkness. but as it moved, his heart sank. It wasn't a shadow. It was the woman. She was taller than he remembered from the stories, her skin stretched thin over her bones, her eyes hollow pits. Her mouth was too wide, and her smile far too stretched. The faint light from his lantern glinted off her sharp, yellowed teeth. "You came," she rasped. "Just like the others. Just like the ones before you." Thomas stepped back, his pulse racing. His thoughts spun, but one thing was clear, there was no escaping her. He couldn't leave. He shouldn't have come. Why are you doing this?" he managed to ask, his voice trembling. She tilted her head, a sickeningly slow motion, and her smile widened impossibly. "Not me," she whispered. "The fog, it calls for you. All who come, belong." The shadows in the room shifted, and Thomas gasped as he saw them, dozens of figures, half-formed, standing in the dark. Their faces were blank, their bodies twisted and wrong, but their eyes, all of them, were focused on him, watching him with an intensity that chilled him to his core. "You see, Thomas," the woman's voice cut through the air, like dry leaves scraping on stone, "we're all here. We're stuck here. The fog doesn't let us leave. And it won't let you, either." The room seemed to close in on him, the shadows pressing in like fingers tightening around his chest. The figures began to move toward him, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "Join us," they whispered in unison. "Be part of us." His heart thudded painfully in his chest, and he felt the weight of the fog, the curse, surrounding him. He stumbled back, desperately searching for an escape, but the shadows pressed in. There was no way out. Then, just as the figures reached for him, the woman's smile twisted into something darker, more predatory. "Too late," she whispered. "You're already here. And now, you will never leave." The town awoke the next morning to yet another disappearance. The villagers were already on edge, but when they noticed Thomas's absence, a new sense of dread settled over them. The fog seemed thicker, more oppressive than ever, and there was no sign of him, no trace, no footprints in the snow. Only the ever-present mist, stretching across the mountain like an endless, suffocating veil. And once again, the resort stood silent, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too close to its curse. As the weeks passed since Thomas's disappearance, the town seemed to grow quieter, as though the life had been slowly drained from it. The fog was thicker now, more oppressive, and it stretched far beyond the mountains, creeping into every corner of the village like a suffocating cloud. People didn't speak of the resort anymore, the very mention of it felt dangerous, as though speaking its name would somehow bring the curse closer. Yet, the villagers' lives had changed. They no longer gathered at the inn to tell stories, they only huddled inside their homes, looking out the windows at the thickening fog, wondering who would be next. But there was one person still determined to uncover the truth, the last person left in the town with the courage to face the resort. Her name was Nora, the daughter of the village healer, and she had heard every tale. Growing up, she had been warned about the resort, but unlike the others, she had always felt a burning curiosity, a desire to understand the dark forces that seemed to haunt the mountain. Her mother, a quiet woman who had lived through the worst of the town's history, had often warned Nora to stay away from the mountain, but Nora had never truly understood why. It wasn't until the disappearances had begun, until Emily, Samuel, and Thomas vanished, that the weight of the warnings truly hit her. Her mother's cryptic words, "The mountain takes what it wants and never lets go," now echoed in her mind. The fear that had kept everyone else in the village in their homes only pushed Nora further toward the truth. One bitter evening, after the last traces of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains, Nora packed a bag with herbs, a knife, a lantern, and the journal her mother had kept for years, though her mother had always insisted it was nothing but old superstitions. With her heart heavy with resolve, Nora stepped out of her house and made her way up the winding road toward the mountain. As she walked, the familiar sound of her footsteps crunching in the snow felt strangely hollow. The air grew colder the higher she climbed, and soon the fog surrounded her, swallowing the path ahead. It clung to her like a living thing, twisting and curling, blocking her vision until she could barely see the next step. But Nora kept going. She had to. When she finally reached the resort, it stood before her in all its decayed, haunted glory. The windows were shattered, the wooden beams splintered and falling apart. Yet there was an unsettling stillness in the air, as if the place was waiting. The fog seemed to come from within, as though it had been birthed by the very walls of the lodge. Nora swallowed her fear and pushed open the front door. It creaked in protest, but it was a familiar sound, one she had heard in all the stories. The smell of mildew and decay assaulted her senses, but she forced herself to breathe through it, steadying her heart as she stepped inside. The silence inside the lodge was overwhelming. The air felt thick, stagnant, as though time had frozen here, waiting for something to happen. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and Nora could hear her own breath echoing in the cavernous, empty rooms. The only sound was the distant rustle of wind and the faint drip of water somewhere deep inside the building. She moved cautiously, her lantern casting a faint, trembling light on the walls, which seemed to close in on her with every step. It was a place frozen in time, a place that no one had left for years. As Nora ventured deeper into the building, she felt the oppressive weight of something watching her. The whispers began then, just on the edge of her hearing, like faint murmurs carried by the wind. She couldn't understand them, but their tone was unmistakable, urgent, pleading, desperate. The whispers grew louder, and with them, a sense of coldness wrapped around her heart. At the base of the stairs, she hesitated for only a moment. The basement, the place where the darkness had taken root, where Emily and the others had disappeared. But she had no choice. She had to go down there. If there were answers, they would be found in the depths of the lodge, where the curse had begun. The basement door creaked open, its rusted hinges protesting against the weight of years. As she descended the stairs, the temperature dropped further, the air growing so frigid it felt like the breath of the grave. The shadows shifted in the corners of her vision, moving just out of reach of the lantern's light. She gripped the journal tightly in one hand, her other hand clutching the knife she had brought. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement stretched out before her, a large, dimly lit space that felt like the heart of the curse. And there it was, the altar, more imposing than before, its stone surface dark with stains that looked too fresh. Around the altar were symbols, strange and ancient, carved into the stone floor. Nora's heart raced. She wasn't sure if it was the place that made her feel this way or the presence that had settled around her like a heavy fog. But it was what she saw next that made her blood run cold. Lying sprawled on the altar, as though in a deep, unnatural slumber, was Emily. Her face was pale, her eyes closed, but there was no mistaking it. She was alive, or at least, she was still breathing. But her body was covered in strange marks, dark veins running across her skin like a web of rot. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream, her eyes flickering behind closed lids as though trapped in a nightmare. Nora's hand shook as she raised the lantern to get a closer look. The symbols etched around the altar pulsed faintly, glowing with an unnatural light. They seemed to hum, vibrating through the stone, as though they were alive. A strange energy filled the room, and Nora's breath caught in her throat. "Emily," she whispered, her voice trembling. Emily's eyes snapped open, wide with terror. They were no longer the eyes Nora remembered, their pupils were now dark and inhuman, filled with a hollow void. "Leave," Emily rasped, her voice weak, but desperate. "You shouldn't have come. It will take you too. It will never let you go." Nora recoiled in horror, but before she could react, the shadows in the room began to move. They swirled around the altar, growing darker, thicker, as if the fog itself was pulling into the basement, a swirling vortex of darkness. The voices rose to a deafening crescendo, a mix of wails and whispers, calling out in desperation. The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a heartbeat, the sound deep and oppressive. "Run, Nora! Emily screamed. "You have to leave." But it was too late. The darkness swallowed everything. The next morning, the villagers woke to the same heavy silence that had become their reality. The fog was thick, just as it always was, but there was something different. Something missing. Nora's house stood empty, her belongings untouched, as though she had never returned. And the resort remained, its crumbling walls hidden beneath the thick fog, its whispers continuing to call for more souls to wander in. No one dared speak of it. The curse of the mountain resort had claimed another. And so it would continue, forever.